Hello, AP and CCP U.S. history students. Today we're going to talk about sectionalism and the Civil War. Basically, it's the building blocks that build up towards the Civil War. We've already been kind of talking about a few of them, but these are the ones that are literally right before the conflict. So we're talking about the late 1840s, early 1850s, all the way up to the election of Lincoln in 1860. So basically, why the North and South were so different, which plays into the idea of why there was a conflict between the two regions of the United States. First of all, as you looked at the other day, last week, when you were looking at the difference between the North and the South, when you were watching the video about New York City, and of course, looking at the Hermitage page to see how somebody like Andrew Jackson lived his life. The Southern Planter Society of Andrew Jackson, of Thomas Jefferson, of John C. Calhoun, of all those Southern aristocrats, was run primarily by King Cotton. Cotton had become the king of all plants during the late 1700s, early 1800s, after the invention of the cotton gin. Prior to this, cotton was very expensive to produce. It was very time consuming. So therefore, it was not the plant of choice. In fact, in places like South Carolina, the plant of choice was rice. In places like Georgia, it was peanuts and other things, peaches, if you will. And of course, the king of all crops at that point was tobacco up in both North Carolina and Virginia. But the Southern Planting Society had changed because of the advent of cotton and the cotton gin. It also was a rebirth of Southern Slave Society, and we'll get to that here in a second. The planter aristocracy was very select, if you will. This was a very small group of people. A minority of the people in the South owned plantations. The vast majority of people in the South were either small-time farmers or they were the slaves. And in fact, many places in the South, because cotton, was such a slave-powered industry, there were places in the South where the slave population outnumbered the whites somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 to 1. Certainly in places like South Carolina and Georgia, where cotton was indeed the king of all crops. So the slave system was becoming more brutal. And this is kind of the whole point. When Jefferson talks about how slavery is on its way out in the tobacco era, he's somewhat correct in that, because tobacco is becoming less and less profitable. And of course, the slave system is becoming more and more expensive. So tobacco farmers were starting to kind of ease off on slave society. They certainly didn't have plantations of 500 to 1,000 slaves. Back in this time period, in the late 1700s, when Washington and Jefferson had their plantations in Virginia, they were the largest slave owners, and they had, Washington had about 200, 250 slaves, and that was somewhat comparable to Jefferson. And they were the largest landowners, largest, most profitable tobacco farmers. In South Carolina in the 1830s and 40s, there were plantations that had thousands of slaves. So you're talking about not just a rebirth of the slave system, but a changing of it as well. Keep in mind as well that the international slave trade stopped in 1808, at least on paper. And the paper we're talking about is the Constitution. The Constitution outlawed it past 1808. That was one of the compromises from the Constitutional Convention. But the slavery still existed. So how do you get new slaves in if you're not shipping them in from other places? Now, of course, there were going to be people, there were going to be slavers that acted as, basically, kind of sneaking them in, if you will. And I'm blanking. I'm sorry. It's late. I'm blanking on the word I'm looking for. These guys were basically sneaking the slaves in. They were avoiding authorities. They were landing at random ports, if you will, and offloading their cargo. So certainly there were some people that were somewhat bootlegging or, scamming slaves into the country. And that's certainly, one way that they're coming in, but it was insanely expensive to do that. So what they really had to do was make sure that the slave population that they currently had was in some way, shape, or form going to reproduce itself. Well, that was not exactly something that you could just force. So, they encouraged slaves to get married. They encouraged slaves to have multiple children. But there were a lot of slaves who didn't want to bring children into the world, especially a world where they were going to be slaves themselves. There were a lot of slaves that really didn't want to have children because of that continued existence of slavery. So all of this is playing into slave society. And slavery is getting more brutal. Slaves can be replaced, if they're not kind of pulling their own weight. And there are countless times that if a slave runs away, that the slave owner puts a bounty on their head. Instead of saying, hey, I want you to capture him and bring him back, they're literally saying, I want you to kill him, as punishment, so that I can, and then bring the body back so I can show all their friends what happens when you run away. So this is getting more brutal. And you're talking about a lot of slave masters who are saying, if the slaves aren't going to reproduce on their own, then I'm going to make it happen, which you're talking about forced rapes by the slave owners and taskmasters and whatever else. So you're getting a really, really bad picture of what slave society looks like during this time period because of the necessity to replenish the supply of slaves through reproduction rather than trade. So, and I'm just now dawning on me, smuggling was the word I was looking for. Again, smuggling was kind of an expensive undertaking, and it was very risky. So if you wanted more slaves, breeding was really the only way to garner the type of numbers that you really wanted. So again, the slave system is changing for the worse. And, slavery is already bad, but you're talking about adding another level of violent behavior on top of it. And of course, the white majority of the South, that it depended on the region you were in. Some states, the whites were the majority, but other states, not so much. Like I said, in South Carolina and Georgia, blacks were considered kind of the majority population, if you will. Now, there were some free blacks. There were some people who had earned their freedom through paying off their slave wages, if you will. They had kind of paid their way to freedom. Some had been granted freedom by their masters because their masters had valued them above all because of work they'd done or because of some sort of favor that they had done or whatever else. But it was very, very small amount. And plantation slavery, like I was saying, was becoming more and more brutal. So life as a slave was not easy. You're talking about waking up, before the sun comes up, and most days working until the sun goes down, and even past that. There were even some slaves that had to work on full moons even longer because it was bright enough outside to still pick cotton. And it's backbreaking work. You're down in the dust all day. You're hunched over. You're picking the cotton. You're storing it in bags. You're carrying it in on above your head, if you will, or on your back. It's backbreaking work, and it's not an easy thing to do. So there, prior to this, had been slave rebellions, and whether it be Nat Turner, whether it be Gabriel, whether it be the Stoner Rebellion, whatever, there had been slave uprisings. Slaves during the 1800s start to find newer ways to rebel. They start sabotaging equipment. They start finding ways around work. So rebellion kind of changes a little bit. And then, of course, you have some that are trying to escape, and they come up with ingenious ways to escape. They would. This is kind of the birth of what becomes known as the Negro spiritual. That the spiritual was the idea that they would start singing a song. One of the more famous ones was "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and there was a kind of key word within the song that when they hit that verse, they knew it was safe to make a run for it. That the slave who was trying to escape would go then, because the taskmaster was either distracted, not paying attention, whatever the case may be, and then they would hop on to the Underground Railroad, which of course isn't an actual train. It's a group of people that are sneaking these slaves who are what are considered fugitive slaves north, trying to guide them to freedom. And of course, that's where Harriet Tubman comes in. And of course, the people that are really pushing for this are the abolitionists. The abolitionists are pictured here. Early movements of abolition actually start in the South, believe it or not. The Northerners really, if it's not in their face, they really don't see it. There's not a big push for it. But it gradually maneuvers north, especially as cotton becomes more and more of a cash crop. And abolitionist starts to grow, but it's mostly a feeling that, people would say, like, I'm opposed to slavery, but that's about as far as it went. They weren't really writing impassioned essays. They weren't protesting the government. They weren't going down to the South and participating in the Underground Railroad. They were, this was kind of more of a, well, we disagree with it, but that's really a problem for the South type mentality. The agitators or the radicals are going to be people like William Lloyd Garrison, pictured to the bottom right, Sojourner Truth, who's pictured in the center there, or the bottom left, if you will, and then Frederick Douglass, who's pictured on the top there. Those three are the big names. There are a multitude of other people that are going to participate in the abolitionist movement, of course, and they're going to be the ones that kind of grow and prosper the cause at an exponential rate over the course of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. It really starts with William Lloyd Garrison writing his newspaper, The Liberator. He's somebody that is just not going to back down. He is threatened constantly by Southerners who want to see him and his voice kind of silenced. They don't like his newspaper, and of course he ships his newspaper down to the South to protest the institution of slavery as well. He's kind of bolstered in his efforts by Sojourner Truth, who writes poetry and speaks out against the injustices of slavery. And you've got Frederick Douglass, who writes his autobiography and is so eloquent as a speaker that there are Southerners who make the claim that he was never actually born into slavery and that he was not really an escaped slave, that he was just kind of making it up. He ends up going down to the South and purchasing his freedom, even though he had escaped. He goes down to pay back his master to prove that he was indeed a slave at one point. By buying his freedom, he was able to get that paperwork that kind of proved it. That's kind of where they were headed with this, that they were so serious about this that they were trying to kind of get their street cred, if you will, as being escaped slaves and people that could legitimately talk about the evils of slavery. The Southern backlash is to basically threaten these people, to threaten Northern interests. That if anybody in Congress, if any senator were to stand up and quote the Liberator or quote Frederick Douglass, they would be shouted down by the South. There was a definite us versus them mentality starting to grow as the abolitionist movement starts to grow and prosper and gain some traction in the North. And the North starts to actually become a little divided on this as well. There's when we present the Civil War, there are a lot of people out there that make it seem like, and maybe in 8th grade, they kind of presented this as if the North was all in favor of, ending slavery and wanted no part of it. And the South was, of course, fighting for slavery. It's a mixed bag, both North and South. There are Northerners that really don't care about slavery all that much, and many of them are going to go off and fight in the Civil War eventually, who really don't care one way or the other if slaves are freed. And there are people in the South wouldn't care either way. They just don't want their Southern homes to be vandalized or invaded by the North. So, abolition really kind of takes hold in random pockets all throughout the United States, North and South. But again, it becomes a little bit more impassioned, and it certainly becomes more forceful during this time period because of the leadership of people like Garrison, Douglass, and Truth. In the election of 1848, this is the first time that a national political party starts to really kind of bolster the idea of an abolitionist movement. And it's not one of the big parties. The Democrats and the Whigs avoid this issue as much as possible. This is a key ingredient to all the political and social backlash of the 1840s and 50s is slavery is to be avoided, to try, you just try and suppress it as much as you possibly can. Now, there are radical contingents out there that are going to go after this and try and push that this slavery needs to end. But this is the first election where you literally have one entire party saying, we are not okay with this. The Democrats go along with a General Lewis Cass from the War of 1812. The Whigs go along with General Zachary Taylor. So it's a general versus a general. Zachary Taylor had earned a lot of fame on the battlefields of the Mexican War. If you remember, he was the general on the southern border of the Rio Grande who claimed that he had been fired upon by Mexican forces to start the conflict. In the end, the big debate was over whether or not slavery should be used in the expansion to territory. So as we start gaining the territory, still kind of settling what used to be the Louisiana Purchase, but now going out to what is known as the Mexican Cession, which is the land that we gained from Mexico after the Mexican War and into the Oregon country. Now we start getting the question of what do we do? How do we get how do we settle the question of slavery? How do we decide whether or not a new state was going to be free or slave? Well, one of the things that have been proposed was the idea of popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty means that the people of a territory get to decide, that through popular vote, popular opinion, that you get to kind of decide your own way. So this becomes kind of the new way of handling it. Instead of having a compromise, and by this point, Henry Clay is older. He's not as capable as he used to be. He's not as spry as he used to be. So compromise is kind of going on the way out. The new compromise is the idea of just, well, let's let the people of that territory figure it out. But this is going to come and rear its ugly head later on. It seems like a good idea at first, but in practice it doesn't work very well. And this is opposed by a third party called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party is not overwhelmingly abolitionist. This is not a group of people that believe that slavery needs to end. Free Soilers believed that every territory that we took in the West, whether it be Louisiana, whether it be the Mexican cession, whatever, that any territory that we're now going to settle, if there was no slavery to start off, then there will be no slavery in the future. So, for example, Mexico had not allowed for slavery. Since Mexico did not allow for slavery, since they had freed their slaves and they had done away with it, that land initially was free soil. So their argument would be that the Americans can't come in and just introduce slavery to a place that never had it to begin with. Now, the person that runs for their political platform is the old president, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren, of course, had lost in a re-election campaign in 1840 to William Henry Harrison. He had kind of fallen off with the Democrats over the slavery issue because Martin Van Buren was basically an abolitionist. He didn't believe that slavery should exist. So he ends up running. In the end, Taylor wins the election. Taylor, who has no political experience, he's a Louisiana-born general who has slaves. The slave owner becomes president in 1848. So even when the Free Soilers are there, they kind of take away their ability to win this because Lewis Cass is the one that loses votes to Van Buren, not Taylor. So the Democrats the Whigs, I should say, sweep into office with Zachary Taylor. It doesn't last long, actually, because Taylor ends up dying. Now, during the early stages of this administration, there's questions as to what to do with California. California, of course, had been taken by from the Mexicans in the Mexican cession during Polk's campaign in the Mexican War. Now, when California as a territory starts to organize, roughly around 1849, out at Sutter's Mill, somebody finds gold. And so as soon as that happens and word gets out, gold fever strikes and we have the gold rush. So for you football fans that are wondering why the San Francisco football team is called the 49ers, it's in kind of homage to the people that came out to California in 1849 looking for gold. Okay. And it's not surprising that their team colors have gold in it because they are all based around the gold rush, if you will. Now, by gold fever, California becomes kind of a lawless place. So when you see all the old westerns of cowboys and, all these people, that's not really what they're talking about. They're talking about, areas where the law really hadn't come into these towns yet. And of course, as people are panning for gold, not everybody's finding gold. In fact, a very small amount are finding gold. So there's a prevalence of people coming out there that don't strike it rich right away, who want to then steal it instead of find it. It's a whole mess. So California is almost playing catch up when it comes to trying to get law and order within their territory, and they realize very early on that the only way they're really going to be able to maintain some form of law and order is to become a state, is to apply for statehood as soon as possible so they can get federal assistance in settlement, federal assistance in law and order, and government funding for infrastructure. So California pretty much jumps the gun before any of the other Western territories, because keep in mind, this is before states like Colorado or Wyoming ever form, Montana. They have not formed as states yet. So you're talking about going from basically Missouri and jumping all the way out to California with this new territory. Texas is probably the closest at that point when it comes to geographics to California. The rest is just all unsettled territory. So there's kind of this mentality of, hey, we're kind of jumping the gun with California. But now the question is what do we do with California? Because if we go along with the Missouri Compromise line from 1820, that line kind of cuts across the continental United States out to the Pacific coast. Well, California is split by that. So is it a northern or southern state? Do you split it into two and make it two states? What do you do with California? And the problem is, if you split them north and south, well, most of them are around the San Francisco area. That's where the most people were. The area that is currently places like Los Angeles and San Diego are not settled. They're podunk little towns. So the southern portion couldn't apply to be a state anyway. California has decided that territory will be a state and just one. But are you going to split it with the line? So this is where popular sovereignty starts to creep in. And of course, California really didn't have a slave population. They didn't have, nobody's going out there to farm yet. So they don't really have cash crops out there. There's no real need, so to speak, for slavery. So the sectional balance issue becomes a problem. The status of the South in 1850, up until the admission of California, is, hey, we're equal. We have just as many northern states as we do southern states. They had followed suit that when Missouri came in and Maine came in to balance that out north and south, that's basically the route they were taking, that anytime a southern state came in, a northern state was put in as well. So, for example, when Texas comes in, they're going to look to, establish Illinois or establish Minnesota or whatever else, trying to balance that. As Mississippi and Tennessee and all these other states come into the Union, they're trying to balance it north and south as best they can. But then again, there are going to be problems, with the South, if you will. They have territories to states. How do you introduce slavery to an area that may not need it, for example? Because the argument is, oh, well, we've got this line from the Missouri Compromise. Well, New Mexico doesn't have the land for cotton. It doesn't have the soil content for cotton. So if New Mexico isn't going to farm, especially a cash crop, do you really need slaves out there? So you may have a southern territory that doesn't have slavery, and that becomes an issue. What do we do with this? Because if we're going to maintain the sectional balance north and south, we need those territories to actually take it. In fact, some Southerners start to kind of float out the idea that maybe we should go down and take Cuba, because Cuba did have slavery, as another state, that maybe we should do that, because if we're taking all these territories like Oregon in the north, then the United States government should be taking southern territories as well. There are others that are saying we should attack Mexico again and just take more land. So there's kind of always a push from the South that, hey, as territories are starting to move towards statehood, that there should always be a sectional balance in some way, shape, or form. There's always a fear of runaway slaves. The Underground Railroad had done an amazing job at basically creating a pipeline of routes that slaves could take to get to the north and get not only to freedom, but safety as well, where there were volunteers who would be greeting these people, especially in places like Cincinnati. There are plenty of houses in Cincinnati that are Underground Railroad safe houses, where they would get across the Ohio River, and they would be taken and put into a basement for a few days, given food, given places to rest, given a change of clothes, so that they could then continue their route either up into northern New York or into Canada or whatever else, to try and escape any sort of slave hunters, if you will, which did exist because of the fugitive slave law, which we'll get to here in a second. Now, of course, everybody's trying to figure out how to, what the next steps are here. And, as I said before, Henry Clay is getting too old, as are the rest of the Great Triumvirate. If you remember, the Great Triumvirate are the three great congressional leaders: Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. Clay from Kentucky, Calhoun from South Carolina, and Webster from both New Hampshire and Massachusetts. New Hampshire to start off, and then he moves to Massachusetts later on in life. They're getting old. In fact, they're dying. These guys are kind of the last bastion of leaders from that great antebellum time period. But the one thing they always had is Calhoun was always the Southern gentleman who was arguing, for slavery, for the Southern way of life, the Southern mentality. Webster was always the eloquent speaker who was Dartmouth graduate, spoke with eloquence about tariffs and about the American system and about, merchants and industry. And then you had Clay, who was always kind of finding ways to make sure that Calhoun's section of the United States and Webster's section of the United States could find common ground. He was the career compromiser. And that's not to say that Clay didn't have extreme visions of America. He just knew how to put them aside to make sure that those extremists didn't cause massive problems. He had learned from the War of 1812 that you don't go off the deep end as a war hawk to go off and try and solve your problems. So these guys had learned how to basically run the country. Well, now their guidance and leadership is literally dying off, as all these guys will be dead by 1854. Two of them die in 1852. I think it was Webster and Calhoun died first, and then Clay dies last. I could be wrong, but needless to say, as they start to die off, now becomes the question of, well, who's going to take their reins? Who's going to take their place? And the guy that everybody kind of tabbed was a guy named Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois. Stephen A. Douglas comes in, and he is the great proponent of popular sovereignty. He comes in basically saying what the Great Triumvirate had done was great, but it's now time to turn it over to the states, which of course the Southerners liked hearing that the states would decide, and the Northerners liked hearing states will decide, because as they move west, the more of the territory is in the northern regions and the non-slave territories. So they just kind of figure over time this should kind of die out anyway. But then you also have people on both sides that are saying it's not fair, because the South can see, hey, wait a minute, if we're going to have popular sovereignty, we need to get more territory. So they're going to become more hawkish for war. And the North is going to say, well, wait a minute, if we're allowing the states to decide and these states still keep deciding for slavery, we're not getting anywhere when it comes to getting rid of slavery. So it's not an easy fix by any stretch of the imagination. Needless to say, there becomes deadlock and danger as these guys start to die off. And, William H. Seward, who is another one of these guys that's kind of inheriting the leadership of the House and the Senate, William H. Seward, who is from New York, kind of comes in and starts pushing for the idea that, hey, maybe popular sovereignty isn't the best idea, and maybe we need to start handling this issue of slavery a little bit more forceful. The problem is that Zachary Taylor has died. Zachary Taylor has a bowl of cherries and cream. He on a very hot day, gets food poisoning and dies. So Zachary Taylor, after about a 2-year time in the presidency, ends up kicking the bucket. His vice president is Millard Fillmore. Now, Seward's the guy in the center here. Fillmore's the guy over to the right here. Millard Fillmore takes over, and Millard Fillmore, his whole accomplishment in the White House, and I kid you not, when I got a little kid's book about presidents when I was growing up, and I was flipping through about major accomplishments, they had people like, Lincoln freed the slaves, Teddy Roosevelt did the national parks, and Franklin D. Roosevelt got us through the Great Depression. Millard Fillmore's page was he got running water in the White House. He got indoor plumbing. That was his major accomplishment for his 2 years in office. And that should kind of prove the idea that Fillmore didn't do all that much. In reality, his great accomplishment is the Compromise of 1850 that he didn't actually propose. He didn't actually argue for. He just signed into law. So he gets kind of credit for it, but it's not a very good compromise. And it's probably the worst compromise that Henry Clay ever put out there. He was influenced greatly by Stephen A. Douglas in this compromise, and it doesn't work. The Compromise of 1850 basically is the idea that California will be admitted as a state, which throws off the sectional balance. But the South, in exchange, gets a bolstered fugitive slave law. Okay, so the northern areas do strengthen when it comes to free states, but the fugitive slave law that is enforced basically is a direct attack against the Underground Railroad and shuts down the Underground Railroad for the most part throughout the North, which becomes a huge problem because the Northerners really feel like they got sold out, especially since Fillmore is from New York. Okay, and for that matter, Stephen A. Douglas is from Illinois. So you got northern states having leaders that are kind of selling them out to the South, and the abolitionists leaders are furious that the Northerners are almost caving into their demands. So this is not a compromise as much as the opening salvo of a much larger war that's brewing over the next 10 years. Of course, Fillmore doesn't run for re-election because he's just not a very effective leader. The Democrats come out and say, all right, we're going to nominate Franklin Pierce, who is kind of the overshadowed guy from New Hampshire, meaning Daniel Webster had always been the guy from New England, the big man on campus, the guy everybody turned to. Franklin Pierce was widely considered to be like the next guy up. oh, he's going to be like Daniel Webster. And this is, of course, it would be the equivalent of Tom Brady moves from New England down to Tampa Bay, and then New England says, oh, we got this young guy directly out of college who is exactly like Tom Brady, and then he takes his first snap and throws it directly into the ground. That's Franklin Pierce. Oh, he's got a great skill set. No, he doesn't. Franklin Pierce is a Southern apologist. So he basically is just, oh, the South doesn't like it. I guess we won't do it then. So he's really kind of an empty suit when it comes to that. And he's doing whatever it takes to just not have a war, which is not exactly great leadership, when your whole goal is just to avoid conflict in every case whatsoever and just give in whenever. So Franklin Pierce ends up winning against General Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott, if you remember, was a hero from the Mexican War. He was the one that kind of invaded Mexico City, and he was a War of 1812, Mexican War general. He was a war hero, which was the Whigs' strategy most years, is to find a general to run. But it didn't work this time. Franklin Pierce wins. The Whigs basically were split on slavery as the Free Soil Party takes votes away from them, and that pretty much spells the end of the Whigs. Now, it's not surprising. The Whigs had a very hard time gaining traction because Andrew Jackson has been dead for a few years. There's no really polarizing figure that's holding the Whigs together. So by doing so, the Whigs, who weren't exactly unbelievably in favor of General Winfield Scott, many of them split off to the Free Soil Party, and those that remained were not exactly passionate about this, and that pretty much spells the end of the Whigs. Out of the ashes of the Whigs and the Free Soilers, a new party will be born called the Republicans. At the end of the day, Pierce takes over and really doesn't do all that much. Okay. During his time period, he has to deal with all kinds of issues with expansion. U.S. territorial acquisitions during this time period had included arguments about whether or not we should take Panama, which is way the heck down here in between North and South America. So it's not even on this map, but there were questions about whether or not we should take Panama for an eventual use of an overland route between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific to try and help with our trade. So we start to get more and more involved in Central America for the first time. When other countries complain about this, we use the Monroe Doctrine pretty much for the first time to say, hey, we're allowed to do this. Now, of course, this doesn't come to fruition until the early 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt comes in, but this is the next logical stepping stone that we're going to get more and more involved in Latin America. We get involved in Cuba as well. We start messing around with the Cubans, which infuriates the Spanish. We have some Asian issues during this time period as we start to try and force our trade over in the Asian markets, and we start seeing a massive amount of Asian immigration to the West Coast as we start seeing California grow and prosper, especially as they become a slave state. A free state, I should say. And then the Gadsden Purchase, which is this orange territory down here in the southern parts of Arizona and New Mexico. We realize that we need to build a railway that links California and Texas because, again, you'll notice the states here are all in brown. This is the extreme west of the United States of America. We had, of course, taken in and created Missouri and Iowa and parts of Minnesota at this point, but all this other territory is unsettled and certainly not states yet. Texas is as far west as we go. Well, once California becomes a state, we realize we need to link Texas to California for communication, for military usage, whatever else. So in order to build a train route, if you will, out there, we need to buy this territory from Mexico because the Rocky Mountains are right in through here. The Rocky Mountains are going to form a pretty solid barrier, and we realize we have to kind of go south if we want to get out to the West Coast. So we have to purchase this territory, which we do from Mexico, and that was kind of the last acquisition from Mexico. There were a number of congressmen from the South that thought we should just take the territory. Instead, Pierce's administration says maybe we should just buy it and hope for the best later, which is what they do. Now, of course, the lowest point, if you will, of the Franklin Pierce administration was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen A. Douglas is the mastermind behind this. Clay is dead by this point. The Great Triumvirate is gone. They've kind of yielded their legacy to Stephen A. Douglas, and his major contribution here is to figure out how Kansas and Nebraska are going to come into the Union as states. They have been territories, now they're going to be states. Now, Nebraska is coming in and saying, we are a free state. We've never had slavery. We don't need slavery. We are a corn producing state and wheat. Those aren't slave crops. We're not doing that. Kansas is split, though, and they're not split because of the types of crops, because most of Kansas is wheat production. They are split because Southern slave owners had gone to Kansas basically to swing the vote. And why? Because Stephen A. Douglas had put out the idea that these states would decide when they became states by popular vote what they would be, whether they be free or slave, which conflicts with the Missouri Compromise. And it basically says the Missouri Compromise will no longer actually be followed. They're going to throw it out. The reaction to this is a problem. Douglas loses so much support that he actually gets a challenge the next time he's up for his Senate seat 4 years later from a little-known one-term congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Douglas should walk to re-election no problem. Yet he has to go and debate this young upstart because he starts to gain traction within the state. And this is what actually catapults Abraham Lincoln to a national stage, because not only do they hold a debate, they take the transcripts of these debates and publish them into book form, and people read these. They read them because it's the most coherent and smart debate they've read over not just economics and politics, but slavery and how land should be acquired and what should be done about slavery. Lincoln and Douglas have some pretty impassioned and informative debates that people really are riveted by. So in 1858, they hold the debate, and Douglas, even though he wins the Senate seat, it does catapult Lincoln into a household name status. The Democrats are split by the Kansas-Nebraska Act because, again, the Southern Democrats are fine with it and the Northern Democrats don't like it. And out of the ashes, the Republicans form, where some Democrats leave the party and say, I am not okay with this, especially those in the North that are abolitionists. And they join forces with this little-known party that's going to come on the scene awfully quickly. They're going to run their first presidential candidate in 1856. A guy named John C. Fremont, who's a general and a governor of eventually California, as well as some other locations. He's a very well-traveled and well-known person. He's going to run in 1856 and lose. And then in 1860, they'll run their second presidential candidate and he'll win. Kansas becomes the problem. Nebraska, of course, as I said, becomes a free state, but Kansas is split. And they're split because the territorial legislature basically, there are two, and they both claim legitimacy. There's one that settles in Topeka, Kansas, the eventual capital, and there's one that goes to a place called Lecompton. Now, the Lecompton Congress, the Lecompton state legislature, is the slave owners' state legislature. So not surprisingly, when Bleeding Kansas starts to happen, when these settlers who are slave owners kind of meet up with these people who are passionate Kansans who don't want slavery, there is battles. There are pitched battles. It's not like they're just shooting each other. They're literally bringing cannon in. I make the argument that the Civil War actually started earlier in 1857 because that's when Kansas starts to turn into a killing field, that people are actually fighting in Kansas over the issue of slavery. And of course, what ends up happening is the Lecompton state legislature produces a constitution, because one of the steps towards statehood is you have to submit a state constitution. They sent it off to Washington, D.C. for ratification and for legitimacy as being that's the state constitution, and therefore that's the state government. The national government's response, the Congress is going to debate it. Instead, the new president who takes over for Franklin Pierce, who doesn't run in 1856, I should say, because even the Democrats say we're not going along with it. The Whigs don't have anybody on the docket. Like I said, the Republicans form and run Fremont, but James Buchanan runs as kind of a compromise candidate for the North and the South. James Buchanan is from Pennsylvania. He's a very experienced diplomat. He's been Secretary of State. He's widely considered to have the greatest resume of any person coming into the presidency. So everybody assumes that he's going to be fantastic at it. He ends up being rather horrific at it, and most historians rank Buchanan and Pierce as being the two worst presidents. A lot of historians rank Buchanan as the worst. I personally think that Franklin Pierce is the worst, but again, it's not exactly a rat race there. I mean, it's pretty. You're talking about 1 and 1A basically of the worst presidents. Bottom line is, when Lecompton Constitution shows up, Buchanan does the unconscionable thing where he just recognizes it and says, well, that must be the government. So it makes it seem like the slave owners have won in Kansas. This infuriates somebody named John Brown. John Brown was from Ohio, and while he was in a church service in Hudson, Ohio, he heard the preacher preaching out against the evils of slavery. And in the middle of the sermon, John Brown stands up, raises his hand, and pledges before God and the congregation that he will end slavery, he will make it his life's mission, and that he will die trying. And he goes out to Kansas with his sons and attacks a group of slave owners and basically chops them up. I mean, he brutally murders these guys in cold blood for being slave owners, or at least on the slave owning side in the conflict. John Brown's not done with his reign of terror against slavery. He's going to, of course, trump even that later on. Now, as the Union starts to kind of crumble here, there are a number of things that are happening during that time period. Uncle Tom's Cabin comes out in 1852, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and becomes an immediate success. Why? Stowe, who was the daughter of Lyman Beecher, the sister of Henry Ward Beecher, both of whom were big-time preachers during the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, I should say. Lyman Beecher kind of traveled the Midwest. Henry Ward Beecher was a big name in the Christianity back in Brooklyn, New York, which was still a city unto itself before it finally fuses with New York. But Harriet Beecher Stowe basically writes this book because she had seen slavery. She had seen it as she had traveled with her father. She had seen the impact of slavery. She had talked to people that had either worked on the Underground Railroad or who had sought freedom on the Underground Railroad. So she got the kind of lowdown on what slavery was really like. So she tells the story of a plantation where a slave named Uncle Tom is the lead slave, if you will, of a really mean and nasty, horrible slave master named Simon Legree. And she tells the story about the slaves that live on the plantation and what they have to go through. And through reading that book, it pretty much opens people's eyes to the evils of slavery. So, not surprisingly, it helps to bolster the abolitionist cause more so than any other book or any other pamphlet or anything else, because even William Lloyd Garrison is going to look at it and say, anything I've written in the Liberator has not convinced people in the North the way you have. In fact, Lincoln, even when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, almost kind of pins the war on her when he says, so you're the little lady that started this big war. He was kind of given credit where credit was due, but at the same time, I don't think I'd want to be blamed for the Civil War. That's happening. During this time period, a guy named Charles Sumner, who's a senator from Massachusetts, gets up and gives an impassioned speech against slavery on the Senate floor, in which he basically blasts Southern senators for their support of slavery. He purposely goes after a few of the Southern senators so much that one of their cousins, a guy named Preston Brooks, who is a House member over in the House of Representatives, takes his cane, walks over to the Senate, walks all the way down to Sumner, who's sitting in his desk at that point and kind of trapped, if you will, and starts beating him just mercilessly with his cane, so much so that it basically cripples Sumner for life. Sumner never really walks or talks the same way again. He recovers to still serve in the Senate, but he's a shell of his former self. Brooks is never arrested. He's never charged with anything. In fact, there are some Southerners, when they find out that his cane was broken when he was beating Sumner, he literally cracked the cane while he was beating him on the head. Some Southerners send him replacement canes to telling him with little notes, go do it again and kill him this time. That's kind of where we're at. So it's making it very clear that we are on the eve of some pretty violent stuff. And in the election of 1856, like I said, you have Buchanan against Fremont. You have the Know Nothing Party that crops up that nominates the former President Millard Fillmore. The Know Nothing Party was a nativist party. They were an anti-immigrant party. They were predominantly based in cities like Philadelphia and New York because of the anti-immigrant tendencies. This is kind of the racist political party of the North, if you will. If you were a Republican and you were racist, you just switched over and became a know nothing, basically, or at least prejudicial against immigrants. The reason they were called know nothings is when somebody would ask you what your political affiliation was, you would just say, "Well, I know nothing." They were actually called the American Party. But they eventually were known as the Know Nothings because of their code to prove you were what you were. Needless to say, Buchanan becomes president, and he is an abject failure, as I said before. During his time in office, he has to guide the country through the Dred Scott decision. The background of the case is Dred Scott, pictured here, is a slave who was taken by his master from Missouri up into Illinois and Wisconsin. While he is there, he realizes, hey, he's been living in those territories long enough to declare himself a free man. So he petitions for his freedom, and his slave owner refuses to give it. So Dred Scott sues his master for his freedom. It goes to the Supreme Court, and in the court, Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, gives the most racist ruling in the court's history. And that's saying something because there are some pretty racist rulings. But Roger B. Taney basically says that Dred Scott does not have the right to sue for his freedom because he is not a citizen. And he goes even farther. He basically says he's not a man, so he doesn't have a right that we have to respect. That black men are not excuse me, that we don't have to, we are not required in this country to respect the rights of a black man. So he's not just saying that, oh, well, you're still a slave because of a technicality in the law. He's saying the law doesn't apply to you because you're not a citizen, you're not a real American, you're not really a man. So we're literally saying in that Supreme Court case that somebody is not a human being. I mean, that's pretty darn racist. The reactions, the North is horrified by this decision. The South cheers it. And the South, of course, is very happy because Roger B. Taney was from Maryland and he himself was a slave owner. So you want to talk about an unfair jury. In fact, the Supreme Court was a majority of Southerners and most of them held slaves. So this was not a fair jury trial by any stretch for Dred Scott. The justices were overwhelmingly in favor of the Southern cause. But this, of course, galvanizes people. And as economic issues start to creep up during the 1850s, we have a financial crisis during 1857. The results of that panic, just 20 years after the Panic of 1837, the North really starts to falter, but they recover because of their manufacturing interests. The South sees their agricultural prices drop and they don't recover as quickly. So you're talking about the gulf between the North and the South growing even more, where the North is, hurt momentarily but respond, and the South continues to get worse. And of course, land prices fall. When land prices fall, people stop moving. And now you're getting kind of the specter of all these territories sitting out there that are not becoming states. And the South is starting to get antsy because they're getting outvoted on things. And then they're worried that the tariffs are going to be the resolution to this because that's exactly what they did the last time. And they had problems with the tariff issue. So again, you've got a growing dissension between the North and the South over the economy on top of the slavery problems. In steps Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, as a man, is a very soft-spoken guy. He's a very intelligent man. He's self-taught. He never went to, a college or anything. He never had higher level education, being that he was from Kentucky. He was born in Kentucky and raised in Illinois. He was always on the periphery, but he taught himself, and he became political through hard, basically the school of hard knocks. He became a lawyer. He started hanging around politicians to try and get up to date on how the political systems work and what the issues were. And so he kind of figured everything out on his own. He was self-taught in pretty much everything he ever did. And in his early life, he didn't have the greatest schooling, so he made sure that he found his own schooling. He went and found his own books. He borrowed books from people all the time. He was a voracious reader. He always wanted to know what was going on, whether it be science, whether it be math, whether it be politics. He always wanted to know more things. So Lincoln kind of elevated himself from a country bumpkin into a country lawyer and into a national political figure just through sheer grit and determination. It also helps that he is a staggering 6'4" at a time period where most people were 5'7". He was rail thin yet unbelievably strong. And he had kind of honed himself into a physical specimen as well. And by becoming a lawyer, by becoming a political force within Illinois, he becomes the voice that's willing to stand up to Stephen Douglas. And like I said, they have a series of debates in 1858. And even though Lincoln loses to Douglas in the Senate race, he establishes himself as a legit political force, especially in this fledgling Republican Party. And again, he elevates himself, and he kind of gets catapulted by John Brown. John Brown comes back from Kansas and formulates a plan to take the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which is in Virginia, what is today West Virginia. He's going to take the arsenal that is a federal arsenal. He's going to take the weapons, and he's going to go out into the countryside. He's going to get the slaves of that region to come to his cause. He's going to give them weapons, and he's going to lead them as an army of freedom and redemption of these slaves. So the plan is he's going to raid the arsenal, capture it, and that the slaves of the local community are going to rise up, and he's going to have his own slave rebellion that then marches around and kind of frees more slaves and kills slave masters. That's the plan. The results, he does indeed take the arsenal. He does take the arsenal, but then everything goes wrong. Like the slaves that he thought were going to rally to the cause either didn't hear about it because slave owners kind of like squashed all communication in the region as soon as they heard that there was a problem at the arsenal, or the slaves were too afraid to rise up against their masters and join the cause because they had no idea who this guy was, and they were kind of concerned that they were just joining a fool's errand, if you will. So John Brown kind of initially gets the arsenal, and everything looks like it's going well, but in the end he is surrounded by federal troops led, weirdly enough, by a colonel by the name of Robert E. Lee, who eventually becomes the Southern general that leads the Confederacy. In this one, he's wearing a blue coat of the Union, of the United States military. He leads the troops out. He arrests John Brown, and he is convicted. And oddly enough, he is convicted in a state court, and he's convicted in a state court in Virginia of treason. And there are a lot of people that kind of question, can you commit treason against an individual state? And this is kind of the precursor towards a state believing that they could run their own affairs, which is really the precursor to the Confederacy. John Brown is convicted. He is hanged. He, of course, is widely, his hanging is widely celebrated in the South, but in the North, it's mourned. People, and he becomes what is known as a martyr. Even Frederick Douglass says, "I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave." That John Brown becomes kind of the lightning bolt, the lightning rod, if you will, of the cause of going against slavery, the cause of putting down the Confederacy, even before the Confederacy rises up. And it's in the election of 1860 that you see the precursors towards the Civil War definitely forming. The Democratic National Convention happens, and Stephen A. Douglas is widely considered to be the front runner for the Democratic cause. But the Southerners don't trust him because popular sovereignty, while it has been working for him, they realize that could sway any direction it wants because the voters could always swing another way. So even though it had worked for him now, with the Dred Scott decision, with John Brown, with the growing abolitionist cause, they didn't trust it. So therefore, they didn't trust Stephen A. Douglas. And the Southerners walked out, formed their own convention, and nominated John C. Breckinridge. There was another group, and John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. There's another group that says we don't trust that at all, and they formed their own Union party over the Constitution, where they just want the Constitution followed. That's all they want. So they break off from the Democrats, and they nominate a guy named John Bell. So you have three, in reality, Democratic candidates. Well, you only have one Republican, and it really comes down to, do you take William H. Seward, who was widely considered to be the front runner? He was the guy that was kind of the free soil guy. He was the guy that had been pushing for the death of slavery from the start. He was really the anti-slavery candidate. Or do you want a more safe option and go with a guy who had stood up to Stephen A. Douglas before? So Stephen A. Douglas is elevated as the Northern Democrat. Some people said, hey, if Stephen A. Douglas is going to be nominated and there's dissension in the Democrats, why not go with the guy who almost beat him in Illinois? So they nominate Abraham Lincoln. Once Lincoln is nominated, the South, as one voice, says if that guy is elected, we're not staying around because he's not going to be our president. And there's some truth to that because he didn't even appear on the ballot. Abraham Lincoln's name did not appear on the ballot because the Republicans weren't really present in the South. So not surprisingly, when the election happens, Lincoln wins the majority of the North, doesn't even appear on the ballot in the South. The South overwhelmingly votes for John C. Breckinridge or John Bell. And because of that, Lincoln wins the presidency. As soon as that happens, the South says, we told you we're not going to follow this guy. He's not our president. And so you start seeing states, even before Lincoln takes office, secede from the Union because of a procedural thing. Okay. The idea that it was procedural. And like I said, you can see Lincoln captures the majority of the North. Okay. You can see Bell kind of gets this middle area here, these three orange states. I know it's tough to see. And then you got Breckinridge who sweeps the South here. And poor Douglas ends up with a small little part of New Jersey. He ends up with Missouri. And you can see in the popular vote, Lincoln doesn't even get 50% of the popular vote, but he gets a majority there. And like we've said before, the popular vote doesn't count as the Electoral College. Well, Lincoln wins the Electoral College. He gets over 50%. The other three candidates split the remainder, and Lincoln becomes president of the United States. Okay. And that becomes the next step. Because of Lincoln winning without ever really being on the ballot, he is widely considered and seen by the South as not being their guy, and that they're not really participating in the Union anyway. So why did the South secede? Number one, the majority of free states in the House of Representatives, they are worried that the free states are dominating. That the free states are dominating one house, and if they have an imbalance in the Senate, there's nothing they can do, and they're worried that they're going to be told they can't have slaves. They're going to be worried that tariffs are going to go out of control. They're worried that the economy is going to be basically more more northern, and protective of their economic interests and not the South. So there is a fear there. They're afraid of the Republican Party. If Lincoln is the face of the Republican Party, believe it or not, Seward was the one that they should have been worried about. He was the one that was definitely more of a threat to their way of life. Lincoln was actually the compromise candidate, but it still wasn't enough to allay the fears of the Southerners. Abolitionists scare the bejesus out of them, so do free soilers. The idea that, hey, there are people out there that are trying to end their peculiar institution, as they called it. Southern cotton avoids war. They kind of figured that there won't be a war because everybody needs their cotton, so nobody's going to want to attack them. They're wrong in that. South could broker a better deal with Europe. They honestly believed that if they broke off, they could make better trade deals with England and with France and Spain on their own. They didn't. That was a miscalculation. They were afraid of tariffs. That's a legit. They did have nationalism, and this was their Declaration of Independence moment. This was their moment to say, we no longer are going to be under the burden and tyranny of a foreign power. Of this, we had said, hey, King George III is this tyrant over across the sea. The South is basically saying we're not going to follow this tyrant across the Potomac. We're not going to follow the guy in D.C., which was Lincoln. And again, Lincoln, this happens before he ever takes the oath of office. These states start to secede, which means his first inaugural address is literally kind of like a, hey, guys, you can come back. I'm not the boogeyman. I promise we can get through this. They don't. They fire on Fort Sumter about a month later, and the Civil War occurs. We'll talk about that much more when we get back from break. Hope you guys are staying healthy. Hope you guys are staying safe. And I wish you guys the best break in the world. A reminder, you have a test over all the stuff that we've had videos on and all the supplementals. There is an extra video that I've had attached to this that is Ken Burns' Civil War series, which actually does what I just did, but does it a little bit better. It's certainly more interesting than me talking. So you may want to watch that instead of this. I know it's at the end of this video, but for those of you that maybe are confused by some of this, that video is there for your educational purposes as well. But you have to take that test. And then there is also the speech assignment on Lincoln. Both of those will be posted tomorrow, which will be Saturday, the 19th. So please make sure that you get on and get that done before you come back on the 4th of January. We'll see you then. And of course, by coming back, I mean logging on. So you have some things to do over break. And a reminder, we're coming back remote on the 4th. You do have your midterm assignment out there as well. So don't forget to do those things. If you have any questions or concerns, reach out through email. I know some teachers will turn off their email over break. I will not. So you can certainly reach out whenever you need to ask questions. And if you need, in a pinch, to have a Zoom conference just to kind of square some things, then please feel free to reach out and do that as well. Have a good one, folks.